We're not doing mystery stories. We're not doing sort of things that have a sort of neat solution.
The nature of storytelling, work with that as a theme.
I couldn't agree more.
I always have to blame you, in part, for me being a writer, because I was living in Mexico around then, and your book came out, I think it was your first book. It was about Nietzsche's sister.
Yeah.
And it was the craziest story I'd ever read. And I was kind of traveling then in Latin America. I ended up traveling through these parts. And I was reading this book thinking, this is the craziest story. How do you tell a story like this? So I'm just even curious how you came across that. And you're to blame for everything for me. So.
Ah, what an incredibly kind thing to say, David. I'm astonished to hear that. That was a long time ago.
What year was that?
1990 that came out.
1990. So yes, so that was right when my chronology is correct.
Absolutely
yes.
right.
Yeah.
It was a mad story.
Yeah.
This was the story of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's sister,
Yes.
who set up a kind of early Nazi colony in Paraguay. And she took with her 16 white peasant families from Saxony and created a kind of Aryan republic in the jungle. I mean, absolutely bonkers. And I went to try and find it, and they're all still there.
That was the craziest part to me, that you tracked down and there were still descendants.
Yeah.
When was the colony attempted to be found? It must have been...
She founded it in 1880. It was a disaster.
Yeah.
She immediately abandoned it.
Her husband committed suicide.
Her husband committed suicide. She went back to Germany and took over Nietzsche's propaganda.
Yeah.
He was insane by that point, and so she became his propagandist.
And in a very destructive way.
Brutally destructive. Turned him into a Nazi.
Yeah, Nazi.
But they're all still there. So there's this place called Nueva Germania, New Germany, in the middle of the Paraguayan jungle.
There was a small part that had entered my brain as I was heading down. Can I try to find what I did? And I read your travelogue. I didn't actually try to find the place.
Well, do you know, weirdly, they've now built a road. I went by river and then on horseback.
Yes.
But now you can take a motorway to Nueva Germania. If you want to go, it's a pretty forsaken place.
So, but it really was. It's one of the time I said, well, you can really do these crazy things with nonfiction. You can come up with these eccentric stories, things you would not expect. I'm curious how you even found it.
By pure accident. She's a footnote in the... I studied Nietzsche at university, and she's a footnote in the Nietzsche literature, really. And they're all... The Nietzscheans are all a bit embarrassed about her because she's a ghastly... Well, she was a terrible woman. And so I just thought it was fascinating that she'd done this mad thing. And I just wanted to find out. But it was a strange book because it was sort of partly a travel book and partly a book about philosophy and partly the kind of things that we write, a kind of narrative, non-fiction reconstruction of a real story. But the search for Percy Fawcett.
Similar, right? Similar. And also a footnote. I found that one as a footnote. I was doing a story for the New Yorker magazine on the world's greatest Sherlock Holmes scholar who was found mysteriously garroted in his apartment, true story. And when I was researching that story, I read everything I could about Conan Doyle. And in one of the books, because he had written obviously the Sherlock Holmes canon, and in one of the books I noticed a footnote that said one of the inspirations for Conan Doyle's novel, The Lost World, had been an explorer named Percy Harrison Fawcett. I said, well, I've never heard of this person. And so I looked it up in one of these old newspaper databases, and up came all these crazy headlines about, explorer disappears into the Amazon, with his son looking for a lost city, which he called the City of Z. So that's where that one began. But again, a footnote. It really, if my memory is correct, it was just a footnote that set me on my way.
But I've always been, I don't know about you, David, I've always been sort of fascinated by the footnotes. I sort of think, a bit of a cliche really, but the road less travelled is often hugely fascinating because we're not dealing with the obvious kind of highways of history, or I'm not, and I don't think you are either. Yeah. And so seeking out these kind of tributaries and the oxbows of history is sort of in a way much more rewarding, I think, because when you look for these things, you find so much. People wrote down so much about what happened to them. At
least for me, and I appreciate the people who are able to tackle the big story, but I always just feel like I'm trotting on ground that has already been trod. And maybe it's a lack of confidence in my abilities that I'm going to add something new. Does the world need one more biography of Abraham Lincoln? I just think no. But if you can find a way into these stories. You can still hit the main stories, but if you could come at them from a side angle or a side perspective and still get all the major themes or the important, tributaries of history, and yet you're kind of just seeing it from a different point of view or a different perspective.
I think that's beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. It's a way of telling a big story in a way through a smaller lens that allows you to sort of drill down further into it, and then if it works, opening it up. But do you find, I find that these stories, these narrative non-fiction stories, work if there's sufficient material.
You are only as good as the underlying. People always say, what is the hardest part of the most important part of the process? And I always say, it's first coming up with the idea, and attach that is, are there enough underlying material? Because you're not just writing a Wikipedia entry. If you don't have the diaries or the journals or the transcripts or the declassified documents or the people who can provide you detailed oral histories, there's no way you can reconstruct these as narratives. They're just going to be, this happened on this day. I think the trick for what we try to do is to get as close to another person's consciousness as possible. We can't enter it because we're not doing fiction. Get as close to that as we can based on the underlying records.
I think that's absolutely right. And the point you make about not doing fiction is the one that is, for me, absolutely central, because the temptation with stories like these is if you don't have enough material, and you can read it when people don't, they start to speculate. They start to say, perhaps he felt this, perhaps he saw that, perhaps he heard that, or at this point something else was happening off stage. When I read a book, a non-fiction book that starts to say that, I smell a rat. I start to think, you've run out, you don't have enough. And I have a bottom drawer that is filled with projects. Some of them, I think, fascinating stories for which I could not find the warp and the weft. I couldn't find enough blocks to make it work.
The cemetery for stories I have not told is vast and wide. I try not to go past 3 months. I try to set a limit on it, or at least an infrequent, investigation, or maybe over a year, but not full time. Because the last thing you want to do is to get into a project 2.5 years and say, oh, there's nothing here.
And I don't know about you, but for me, the gold dust is when you find a diary or a letter that allows you to say, the room smelled of fresh croissant that morning, and it's true.
It rarely happens, but when it does, you have that moment of, research involves serendipity. It involves, it's a treasure hunt. To me, it's the great joy, because 80% of research is tedium, and 20% is pure joy and revelation. And maybe I'm even exaggerating the point of revelation, but in any case, when the revelation then comes, it's so amazing. And I remember when I was doing Percy Harrison Fawcett for the book, The Lost City of Z, and I tracked down his granddaughter, who lived in Wales. Never forget that, it was many years ago. I go to the house, and we're chatting, and I'm explaining my bizarre interest, this obsessive interest in her grandfather, what had happened to him, this city exists, this place he had described. And she said, well, do you want to know what really happened to my grandfather? And I said, well, yeah, sure, if that's possible after all these years. And she led me into this back room, and there was this old wooden chest. Fantastic. She opens up the chest, and inside are all these little books. The bindings are disintegrating. They're held together by these little ribbons. Some had little locks. They're mud stained, water stained, rain stained. And I said, what are they? She said, those are my grandfather's secret diaries and logbooks. And I just said, oh my God.
Well, that is catnip, isn't it? But it does happen. The 20th century was such a literate century, packed with material, and people keep material. We always think that it disappears, but so often I'll go to a family and say, have you kept anything from Grandpa? And they'll go, oh yes, there's actually, I had an experience just like yours when I was writing a book about a wartime operation called Operation Mincemeat, which was the famous case when the dead body was used to transfer information to the Germans, false information. And I went to see the son of the main architect of that. And much like you, I had one of those moments where I said, is there anything around? And he said, and there was a sort of twinkle in his eye. He said, yes, I've got this chest upstairs. And we went upstairs, and in it were all these secret documents that Ewan Montague, the man who'd organised Mincemeat, had actually just simply taken at the end of the war, totally illegally, and put them in a trunk. And there they all were. And there's something about going through that stuff thinking, my God, nobody's read this. Nobody's seen this for 50 years.
I remember also when I was doing the Lost City of Z, there were 3 people on that expedition, and one of the members of the expedition, the last expedition, had really been completely forgotten. It was Fawcett, who was the explorer, who took his older son with him. Lots of letters, he had written back, had lots of documentations, but Fawcett's older son had brought his best friend with him, a guy named Raleigh Rimmel, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And I couldn't find anything that he had written or much about him. And I spent years trying to find any descendant. His parents hadn't had any. I couldn't find anyone. I checked wills. I had someone help me, and it was years when I had finished the book. And finally, I had found. I don't even remember now. It was like a cousin of one of the parents, I think. I called her up, and I said, by any chance, are you a relative of Raleigh Rimmel? She said, oh, yes, and I knew them. And I said, oh my God, and then we had this lovely conversation, and then I said at the very end, I said, by any chance, did he send any letters home from the expedition? And she said, oh yes, I've kept them in the attic all these years. And I'm being honest, I literally weep, because it had been years, and they were terrific, and I just called up my publisher and editor and said, we're going to have to just hold off. I got some new material I got to put in here.
But I mean, realistically, of course, I mean, those are fantastic, those moments, but they are rare.
Yes. Well, that's why you say the 80%, should we make it 90%?
I would say nearer 90. I don't know about you, David, but I spend a lot of my time in archives leafing through material that will never be used.
Yeah.
You know, and in a way, somehow the time spent on that helps when you do suddenly hit the nugget.
It does, and I always say, it's why you do have to do it in person.
Yeah.
You really do have.
Can't use a researcher.
You really have to, go and actually hold and handle and commune with the documents, because half the time, especially with these old stories, these aren't even often properly archived, or the records haven't been kept, because most people. I mean, I remember for Killers of the Flower Moon, most of those archives, which was that book was about the systematic killing of members of the Osage Nation for their oil money in the early 20th century. And so most of the records from the trials, from Bureau of Indian Affairs, they all ended up in a branch of the National Archives in Fort Worth, Texas, which is this enormous archive. It looks like, I always joke, it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they stick the last covenant.
Bringing the trolley.
Yeah, they're bringing the trolley. And I'm like, it's like you could fit several airplanes into this thing. I mean, I spent weeks there, I did all these trips. And much of it is you're just sitting there from 8 till 5, or they close. But every once in a while, I remember I was looking through records, and I pulled out a file. I wasn't looking for it. It wasn't listed anywhere on any of the kind of registry of what was in the archives. And the papers were all kind of not held together, pell-mell, that's the right word for it. And what is this? But I start to see all the names of the people I'm writing about. I start reading testimony from them, and I realize it's the secret grand jury testimony. And it made me think of you when you said these secret documents were taken. Secret grand jury testimony is not supposed to be in a public archive. Right. It happened to be, I think it was the state attorney general or his secretary was cleaning out the office, dumped these into this file, and they just been sitting there unmarked, and they were a gold mine.
Well, I mean, secret documents, I'd love to talk to you about those, because of course a lot of the material I'm looking at is declassified stuff. It's, I mean, in Britain as in the US, secret documents do get declassified. There's a complicated system for applying for them, but in Britain, MI5 documents, the security service documents, can be released after 50 years. They're not always. They can be retained on grounds of national security. But there's something about those secret archives that is absolutely magical, because they are never intended to be read by people like you and me. We're not supposed to get our hands on them. They are written by and for people who believe they will always be retained. And so they're honest. Most government documents, as we know, try to give a particular impression of the writer or the situation they're in, because they know that they will eventually be read by the public. These are qualitatively different, because they're not meant to be read by you and me. And so when it goes wrong, and intelligence almost always goes wrong. I mean, cock-up happens much more often than conspiracy. They literally are writing in the margin, we're completely screwed here. You know, I've got to apply to Bertie. Where is Bertie? Bertie's disappeared. You know, so there's an honesty and an immediacy to them that is quite extraordinary. And I don't know about you, but that moment when I feel a personality, a character coming at me out of the documents.
Yes.
And particularly when they're handwritten, or they're a note or a diary or a love letter or a poem, that's when the thing can come alive.
I always find it comes alive to me. I'm always obsessed with diction and voice. So sometimes it's not even always what they're saying, but the way they speak. When you get a document, you can suddenly hear their voice. In fact, one of the reasons that secret grand jury testimony was so revelatory to me was because normally in a trial, people just say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, you know, you're limited in your answers. And the trial, they were giving these long, and I could suddenly tell who was literate, who was semi-literate, the way they spoke, and it was just even their mannerisms, their diction, their tics. I could suddenly hear them in a way that I couldn't always before in the documents. So they did come alive, and it's an interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. Everybody writes with usually some interest in mind.
Even correspondence trouvé, you know, people who are deliberately writing an exchange of letters intend them to be read.
Yes.
Reading something that is not intended to be read outside a small charmed circle is special. And voice is absolutely critical, which is why, for me, and I'm sure for you in your more modern work, having living witness, having somebody who was there in the room, is again gold dust, because they can tell you what it was really like, what it smelt like.
It's a lot quicker, too.
It's a lot quicker.
People always say, why it takes so long? It takes me so long because I'm trying to figure out what was happening in the room, and there's nobody I can call up, or I got two conflicting accounts. And if they're alive, I just call them up. I say, so where were you sitting? Did you have food on the table? Were you smoking? What did you do? You know?
Quicker, but more fickle, I would say.
Because, interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, because memory, people tell you their stories. And memory is a very malleable thing. I mean, you know, what we think of as our memories are not truth. They are the stories we tell ourselves. Alice Munro was brilliant on this. They're the stories we tell ourselves to make a narrative of our lives. And we sort of share them with other people, and the more we allied with other people's memories, the more those memories become our own. And I find one of the challenges of the sort of modern narrative non-fiction is to try to work out whose memories I can rely on. And frequently I find that people who were in the same room at the same moment with perhaps the same agenda will have completely different memories. And that then raises a tricky moment, because whose memory do we privilege? I mean, I know what I do, and the truth is I try and get as many different perspectives on one moment as I can. And then I just make a sort of Solomonic judgment of which one I'm going to go with.
You know, it's funny, the thing I have noticed more and more, when I was younger, I kind of thought, okay, you sit down on reporting, you know, whatever. I grew up watching, you know, All the President's Men, and you think, you know, this kind of glamorous view is you're going to get the truth. Maybe you're going to bring down a government with the truth, but you're always going to get the truth, and it's going to be crystal clear. You just got to get there. And the older I get and the more I do this, I realize how hard it is and how fallible I am and how fallible the people are who are sharing it. And it doesn't mean that I believe no less in the truth. It's just that unearthing it and getting it is so challenging. You know, the joke is if you call one person, you're like, oh, the story's really clear. You call a second person, you say, uh-oh. And by the third person, you say, oh my God, what is this story? I don't know. Everyone's thought three different things.
Absolutely.
One of the approaches that I have, you know, especially in Killers of the Flower Moon and The Wager, I'm much more conscious of is trying to acknowledge the doubts, to kind of let the doubts breathe. And often the nature of storytelling, or the way people are remembering the story, to kind of work with that as a theme.
I couldn't agree more. And this does happen, I'm sure it's happened to you, when one runs out of material. I mean, there is always a moment in almost all my books where I think, uh-oh, I just don't know what happened here. I think in a way, if one is honest with the reader about that, and you say there's a gap here.
Yeah, there's a gap.
Without having to bring yourself in, you can make it clear that there's. Clear. Whereas if you start to try and fill it or infill it with other testimony or kind of try and crank it together with what you've got, I think the readers spot that and they know that they're being sold a bit of a pup. So, so what we are doing is not a perfect art, but they're true stories, but the story is as important as the truth in a way. So for me, the narrative is all. And I will choose the story that takes my story. I will take the version that brings my story on.
To life, yes.
I mean, I remember I had a wonderful conversation once with David Cornwall, John le Carré, years ago. He became a sort of friend, and we would walk around Hampstead Heath together, and I was tearing my hair out, stuck. And he said his advice was always that there has to be jeopardy of some sort on every page. And that doesn't mean, is the bomb going to go off? Are the hostages going to be released? It's how do you ensure that the reader feels invested in where the story is taking them?
There are stakes.
Yeah, there's something is at stake.
Characterological stakes, maybe, and natural stakes.
Natural stakes. And my early books, I mean, you were very sweet to mention the Nietzsche book. That one, I would go down a rabbit hole sometimes. I would find something that just interested me, and I disappeared down it. In a way, if you're telling a story and the narrative is what drives the whole thing, and without making it feel false at all, I think that was very good advice.
Talk about a person, too, with slippery truths, if you were
trying. Absolutely.
He would have been the one who was
going to talk about somebody who wrote a correspondence that he intended to be read by everybody.
I mean, Le Carré is like the classic. He's another better example of someone, if you're trying to figure out what was true about somebody, good luck.
Yeah.
But God, what a brilliant writer.
Absolutely.
The gaps are interesting because for Killers of the Flower Moon, I was in that big archive again back in Fort Worth, Texas, and I came across these records that really had demolished the original notion of the book I thought I was writing.
Interesting.
And we talked a little bit about we're after the truth. I mean, that is what we do. And I had always, based on the investigators' theory of these crimes, that these crimes were committed by this singular evil figure who had perpetrated these crimes, along with a couple of henchmen.
The Robert De Niro figure in the film.
Yes, exactly. William K. Hale. And the more records I looked at and interviewed descendants and members of the Osage Nation, the more I realized that this was really a story about a culture of killing, and that this was happening in many families, and that there were many people who were complicit in these crimes. And I began to then investigate these other suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated. And I thought, well, the reader will expect me as the author to resolve these. You followed me along, there's this kind of expectation. You can't open these cases and leave them unresolved. And so I felt this great burden, but the more I looked into them, the witnesses were dead, the suspects were dead. These had never been properly investigated. There had been a conspiracy in this case to cover them up. And I realized there was no way to determine precisely who had done it. And I remember just being thrown because I suddenly was like, this is a different book than I thought. And I kept just staring at this unknowability. And how am I going to present this to the reader? And eventually I just decided, that has to be a major theme of the book. And that these perpetrators had erased not only their victim's life, but also their history. And that's why their stories can't be told. That's why there are these gaps. And I realized that's the horror, that's the power. But that was one of those early times where I confronted that.
There's an unknowability.
There is an unknowability that it's been 20 years I wouldn't know the answer.
But of course that is why what we do or try to do is so different from a novel, because in a novel you would have resolution.
Yes.
The ends would be tied up.
It'd be perfect.
All novels are perfect in their way. They don't share with you the uncertainty of the journey that we're on. Whereas I think the uncertainty, if you can bring the reader into the search without using the first person often. You don't need to. You just take them on the chronological story. I had a similar thing. I wrote a book about a soldier who got trapped behind the lines in the First World War. The trenches were then built, and he ended up in a tiny French village being looked after by the local people. And it's a sort of love story because he fell in love. It's a true story. He fell in love with one of the village girls, and they had a daughter actually born on the eve of the Battle of the Somme. And I met her just before she died.
Boy,
and
what
her
an
story
ominous day for your birth.
Extraordinary. But then he was betrayed, and so the story was a sort of whodunit in a way. I was trying to work out what had happened in this village, and by interviewing the descendants of all the families that had been there, and I couldn't. I knew in the end I wasn't going to be able to resolve it, but in a way, like Killers of the Flower Moon, that perhaps gave it the emotional heft to carry it through. So we're not doing mystery stories. We're not doing sort of things that have a sort of neat solution.
And I do think the truth can lead you into places that are as powerful, startling, and unexpected as fiction. In fact, you know, the notions that we have in our head, our preconceived notions, are often far less interesting than the messiness of the reality of life. But you have to be open to it. And I think one of the dangers, you know, I write a lot about investigators who get tunnel vision, and there's a real risk in that. And I think for what we do too, you need to be able to reassess and say, okay, I thought I was writing this book. And at first you're like, no, but this is the book I'm writing. And you're like, no, but that's not, the evidence is now taking you elsewhere, and you just have to start to reassess, and we're going to write a different book. And that's where the trail and the evidence leads you. And that's also, you know, part of the revelatory process of doing not just nonfiction, but investigative nonfiction, where, you know, you don't often in these cases know the story. It's not like the Civil War or something, or you know, where you completely know the denouement, or you completely know all the architecture of the story because it's been in so many books. In many of these cases, it just isn't. It's scattered in archives, and you're piecing it together, and so you don't know when you go in exactly what the narrative is.
Right, and to your point about, you know, a researcher can't do this because often we're not looking for the things that are the obvious events. You know, we kind of know what happened after what happened. It's the sort of unexpected little grace notes, in a way, the sort of the things that give you character and personality and sort of unexpectedness in a story, which of course again is real life. I mean, that's how the world works. People don't always do logical things or behave, and in a way, I guess what I love about writing this stuff is it always asks to me a very fundamental question, which is, what would you do?
Oh yeah, I love that.
In these circumstances.
I absolutely love that. If it's an interesting story, it's interesting to you because you're asking that, and then the reader will hopefully ask that. I remember for The Wager, you know, I had all these people on this island. They all came from the ship, and they're all descending into this Hobbesian state, and they're all turning on each other, and some are trying to lead one way, some are trying to lead the other way, some are shooting each other. I just get to asking myself, who the hell would I be on that island? And if you think you know the answer, and you think the answer's really easy, you're kidding yourself. So I love that. I think that's a great framework. And that's the stakes, right?
Yeah, and also The Wager is so brilliant because it's an enclosed theatre.
Yes.
It's a scene setter that where everybody is intensely moving on the same stage. And of course, some behave with great courage and dignity in a way that we'd all love to think we were going to behave. And some don't. And I mean, I did a book a couple of years ago on Colditz, the sort of POW camp in Germany, most famous of the prisoner of war camps. And that story has been handed down through sort of British legend as a story of brave chaps with moustaches doing the decent thing and digging their way to victory and escaping and, you know, worsting the Germans and carrying on the war in a different way. The real story is far more interesting than that because not everybody behaves in those predictable, heroic ways.
They never do.
Well, I don't think people do, and I don't think there's any such thing as a hero or a villain. I mean, I think we're all a strange combination of those parts, and you wouldn't know until you're there, until you're on the wager and you're thinking. And human survival is such a fascinating instinct because it takes people in most unexpected ways.
You mentioned the Le Carré thing. Like with a story like that, you know, you say, why do you choose this story? Well, the stakes are there from the very beginning. I mean, you need to set it up, but at some point you're dealing with the most existential, fundamental stakes of all. Will you live or will you die? And then, you know, we were talking about people doing unexpected things. I mean, there were two kind of gigantic figures in that book in terms of ego and determination and different philosophies who are complete nemesis. and coming to blows, and one is being abandoned by the other. And yet there is a moment at the very end when, you know, you're reading the journals and you expect, you know, they're gonna, you know, and instead they shake hands.
It's the most brilliant part of the book, and it's like really moving because we're sympathetic to both of them.
Yeah,
we feel their instincts in both cases.
And they shake hands, and you just say, "I could never." I mean, like, that. I don't think a novelist would have thought. It's just.
Well, if you put it in a novel, people would say, "Well, that's not believable.
Yeah.
That's not." Whereas, in fact, the unbelievable, the things that are. I mean, I love it when it happens that the readers occasionally say, you know, it reads like a novel, its truth is stranger than fiction, but, well, frequently it is. Yes. I mean, frequently the true story is so bizarre and unexpected and counterintuitive, but that's kind of human nature. We don't behave in these set patterns.
Yeah.
And I love those stories about sort of good people who end up finding themselves on the wrong side of history and not bad. There's no such thing as a good or a bad person, but people whose motives are mixed and complicated. I like crooks, and I like people who are
you have crooks
liars
who are heroes and
who sometimes end up doing incredible things and saving lives, but their motives are not these pure Hollywood type stories. I like the sort of, I don't know, the Eddie Chapman figures.
The slightly roguish.
The roguish kind of guys who are opportunistic.
But they did good.
But they did good, and they come into the wager too. There are people who just, there's something about a sort of born survivor that is incredibly attractive, I think.
And then the other thing you were saying too, which I always find interesting, you were talking about the prison camp too, is, and it's not true of all books, but there is something when the world gets shrunk down. You know, a ship or a desolate island is just a contained civilization with all this pressure on it. So it's a great way to explore human nature. I mean, I love, you know, you get to see in these tiny self-contained pressure cookers, and they're all, and human beings inevitably reveal themselves. People say, well, why don't you write about yourself? Well, I'm sitting at my desk or chatting with you, it's really boring, I bore the tears out of you. But you know, you put people, if you put me in a existential pressure, God knows what I would do. You know, that is just narratively so rich because it illuminates human beings. Who the hell are we? What the hell are we going to do?
now that you've mentioned that, I realise that almost all the books I've written take place in a kind of enclosed, I mean, from the mad Paraguayan jungle
a little colony.
to this little village in France, to the kind of planning units that did the deception campaigns, to Colditz, to even the new book I've just done is about a sort of siege situation where hostages are held in an embassy in the UK, and that's 6 days, and it's an intense, tiny theatre that kind of boils down
life
human
and time
behavior.
Is compressed, right? I mean, it's like, rather than a 60-year chronology, we're suddenly in this where everything is happening in those moments, and people will do everything, but people do unexpected things.
Yeah. And this is a book, the one I've just done, it's from the 1980s, and that was a time when everyone was still writing everything down.
Yeah. And were many of them alive too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have, for me, that wonderful combination of living witness plus contemporaneous accounts that haven't been published. Genuinely, I don't know how people will write our stories of the future, because we're not keeping our emails, we're not keeping our text messages, they're disappearing.
You know, even presidential, half the people are on, they disappear, trying to
they've
cloak what they do, or they get erased. And so, no, it really is true. And also, we talk about voice and insight, but, a lot of the social mediums, even if they were to last, they're very bizarre reflections of who we are. I mean, we're talking about when you don't see something. Well, often these things are public now too. So if you go through someone's Twitter feed, like if you're gonna, it's a very performative and often emotional. And you may see someone at the worst of it, but you don't actually often see people in a very contemplative or long or thoughtful or distilling their day or reflection or self-insight. And so you'll have these bursts of revelation, but those bursts, I mean, God, the things I've put on, these bursts of revelation are very distorting of who we are.
They're never really self-reflective.
No.
They're not. No. There's nothing.
They're either like a really bad impulse, which means you're ending your career that day because you did something you shouldn't have.
I think you sent in the resignation letter. Exactly.
Yeah, send the resignation letter, or it's kind of performative. You want people to see you in a certain way, and you're, so. We talked a little bit about how the cemetery of stories that we don't tell. But I think equally important, I wanted to ask you about this, if this was true of your work, is the rabbit holes you go down, and yet you choose not to actually put in the book, or you end up distilling to a couple paragraphs.
Yeah, frequently. But it's never wasted time, I don't think. I mean, you head down the rabbit hole, this happens frequently. You think, this has interested me for the 24 hours I've been doing this. Am I going to take the reader with me? Yeah. Are they going to follow this? Are they interested in this sort of tangent about sort of Paraguayan life in the sort of 16th century? But it adds to the texture, I think. I think it still informs the nature of the narrative you're telling, even if it doesn't end up on the page at all. It's still part of the world. I mean, and we do have to inhabit those worlds. I mean, I have to try and place myself inside the hostage room in that Iranian embassy. You have to move yourself onto the wager and live in it for a while. And knowing how scurvy affects your body is something that I'm sure you could have written 10 pages on that.
Yes.
And you know a lot about it. I'm presupposing here.
Yes, far too much. I bored a lot of people for a long time talking about scurvy. But yes, no, but it's true. And I was curious what you said, because I could not agree more. And I used to get really upset with myself. I'd be like, God, I spent all this time doing all this research, and I wrote 10,000 words about something, and then it's a paragraph. And then now I realized, no, it's just part of the process, and it's the only way you gain authority over material. Yeah. And so, for example, the wager is a really funny example of this. Like, what do I know? I living in New York, 21st century. What the hell do I know about a ship, a British ship in the 18th? I know zero. I mean, absolutely nothing. And so, I spent a year doing research and being tutored by these naval historians and learning all the language and where everybody stood on a ship and how a ship was built. And I remember I got so obsessed with how a ship was built. I just became like how they brought the wood and how the wood was curved and they had to fit the hull. And I wrote, thousands and thousands of words in the beginning of the book about, the building of the ship. And I gave it to my wife. My wife's my first reader. I always hand it to her very nervously. And then I kind of creep around the corner very insecurely, and I just kind of look for...
Never watch them reading it. It's terrifying when they stop.
What I always get is I get, oh God, no. and that's where I'm writing 10,000 words on the ship. And that 10,000 words then becomes, maybe 500 words. But I have the best facts because of that research. I have only the most selective facts. So I have what I call the God No file, which is filled with all these wonderful extra that, but I no longer regret it. The God No file, I used to look at the God No file as just like, God, I'm really foolish and wasting it. And now I realize, no, if I was going to write about the ship and understand the ship and the building of the ship and the best details about the ship, I had to do that. That's how I got to here, and that's just the process.
Please don't get rid of the God No file, David, because the biographers are going to need that. That's the catnip we're talking about for future generations. But I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. That's how we inhabit the worlds that we are trying to recreate, and even if we don't tell every jot or tittle of what was happening. The wager, did you approach that thinking, I hope there's enough material here? Or did you know that there was going to be the first-person accounts that you then rely on, which are wonderful? Yeah. But did you know they were there, or is there a gamble element to these things?
So it's a great question. I talked early on about that early period where I will do very intensive research to figure out what was there. And at first I came across the idea. I came across John Byron, the 16-year-old midshipman who'd been on the wager, went on to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. And I read his account and I thought, oh my God, this is kind of a crazy story. But at that point I didn't think, oh, I'll tell the story, because it gets to that question. I said, well, how am I gonna, this is just one account. How am I? And so then as I began to learn that they had written these competing accounts as they were all fighting over the truth, because some of them survive and they get back to England and they're suddenly summoned to a court-martial and they may be hanged, and so everything is at stake. So they're all telling, now they all have self-interest in why they tell the story. Yeah.
And they're all slightly unreliable narrators.
All unreliable narrators. Once I realized that, that's when I committed to it. Now, even in that point, there's a bit of a gamble and terror, especially with an 18th century story. You're just like, so at every point, you get to a certain point, you realize, yes, there's enough, but you're still, and for months I was like, oh, is this a book? What am I doing? I don't know if you feel that way.
No, me too, absolutely. And it's because frequently at that point, I've already sold it to the publisher, and I'm thinking, oh, I just really hope
you're in trouble now.
But almost always, there's that. It's a bit cliche, but the opening of that box, you find, oh my goodness, there is so much more here, and often they're the stories that people think they know. Now, The Wager will be a familiar story to scholars of the period.
Yes.
And I'm sure those scholars say, well, what's Grann doing? We all know the story of The Wager. That is also, for me, a huge opportunity. I always think, gosh, if people think they know this story, Colditz is a good example.
Yes.
You wouldn't find a person over 30 in Britain who hadn't heard of Colditz, and people did say to me, why are you writing about that? We know about Colditz. But of course, they don't really know about Colditz. Well, and the real story, when looked at from a 21st century perspective, is always different.
It's funny. It's all about perspective and angle. I've always wanted to write about Philby. He's just been somebody Kim Philby, the spy in that group. And I just felt, oh, there's so much. And I've always been too intimidated. I was like, I'll never, I would always read a little bit. And then you came with this wonderful book, A Spy Among Friends, if I remember the title correctly. Yeah. And you suddenly had a way in. I mean, how did you find that way in? It was all perspective. You found a way to tell this story from a different vantage point with this relationship. It got to the very nub of friendship and betrayal. And I thought that was so rich.
That's so kind of you, David. And the answer is quite simple. Yeah. I came to that book because of John le Carré. Walking with David Cornwell on Hampstead Heath one day, I said, I was stuck. I didn't have a book. And I said to him, what's the best Cold War story? Yeah. And he knew what I was doing. He knew I was fishing. And he said, it's very simple. He said, it's the relationship between Kim Philby and Nicholas Elliott. Yeah. He knew Nicholas Elliott. He'd known Elliott from the service. So he'd worked with him in MI5. And so I owe that book to David Cornwell. And he was incredibly helpful with it. But I was very daunted by that book. Also, for exactly the reasons that you say. There had been multiple books about Kim Philby, many of them written from a very clear, rather rigid Cold War perspective. Whereas actually he was a much more interesting character than that. He was, if he walked into the room at a party, we'd all have said, oh, fantastic, Kim Philby's arrived. The party's begun. He was charming, he was funny, he was generous, he was ruthless, he was faithless, he was a brutal man, but he was very attractive.
He had so many friends. That was how he beguiled so many people.
Absolutely, including Nicholas Elliott. I mean, and Elliott's relationship with him. And Elliott is a very sympathetic character. Yes. Elliott is that person that helps us to say, what would we have done?
Yes.
Because in a way, he's every man. Well, he's, you're faced with this character who you love and who's grown up with you and whose clubs, you belong to the same clubs, you followed cricket together, you've got the same world.
Yes.
And yet, anyone who's ever felt any kind of betrayal will see Elliott's story and perhaps see a little bit of their own feelings in it.
Yes, and also very interesting, if I remember that correctly too, is there's a moment where, people know Philby escapes. Yeah. And he kind of has an opportunity, but then the question kind of comes is, did the British government, your point of view, I just thought was really interesting, a little bit like The Wager, did they just kind of want this story? Did they not want a trial? Did they not, is this, again, it gets to the self-interest of the story. Individuals have self-interest in their stories, but so do nations, and so do organizations and institutions. And that seemed to me, I had never thought of, it never occurred to me. I always just thought, Philby outfoxed them, but was there any...
This is the moment when Philby does what they call a flit in intelligence jargon, and he escapes, or he said he escapes. Yes. He gets to Russia anyway. Yeah. So they've got him. They know they've got the business on. I'm not going to. It doesn't give away too much because it happens in the first page of the book. Yeah. And he's gone, and he always described that as him escaping, him somehow slipping out of the clutches. Was he allowed to leave? Was it a kind of moment when Elliott was sent to kind of drill him down and try and get a confession? Did they leave the door open to Moscow? It's my belief that they did not want a trial.
Yeah, they didn't want a trial.
They did not want it back in Britain.
Same as the wager.
I think so.
Yeah,
and I think they were agnostic about whether he drank himself to death in Beirut or did a flit.
Yeah.
But fascinatingly, I thought, one of the things I discovered of that book was a letter written by Philby to Eliot in which he reveals that he himself, Philby, did not know whether he had been allowed to escape, whether it had been intentional.
Right.
So I'm not sure we'll ever be able to answer it, because
that.
the protagonists then, and there are none of them alive now, but nobody really knows.
Yes.
MI6 people will tell you, oh no, we didn't, it was an accident. We didn't really intend for him to escape.
Yes.
But I don't believe that. It's too perfect. It
was also the institution and the class protecting itself, at least.
Absolutely. If they'd all been to Winchester and Cambridge together, the idea that somebody from your, and again, it's that enclosed world thing, that somebody from your kind of secret world had sort of all the time been fooling you. That was what they couldn't, and they still can't.
Yes.
It still sends a
So
shudder through
raw.
MI6, this story.
There's also a reminder to me, that book, because I think sometimes I'm too intimidated by things that are out there, that if you actually keep looking, you can find a way in.
I think that's right, and they don't always have to be new stories.
Yes. Well, I think that's a vanity too, and I always remind myself, even as a journalist, and you've been doing journalism for years too, because we both come out of a similar journalistic craft, which is, you often go to editors or something, and early in my career, you say, oh, well, that newspaper did the story, and in the old days, I say, oh, well, we can't do it. And now I say, but who are we writing for? We're writing for the readers, and most readers are not, they didn't see the one story in the one paper.
In the Milwaukee Gazette.
Like nobody saw it, but it's like a vanity thing. It's like, who are we working for? And I think sometimes too, we're too, most people, we're all living busy lives. We're not all, and just because we're looking at a world doesn't mean, 99% of the people have any awareness or familiarity, or they have a vague idea.
Well, that's even better.
Yeah.
If they have a little hook of memory on it,
Yeah.
and you can use that to reel them in to tell them a wider story. And of course, the book that you wrote about the wager in the 21st century is not the book that someone would have written in 1950, in 1980, and so I'm not a fan of the sort of accountancy attitude to history, where everything's got to be marked down on the plus side or the negative side, or this was bad, this was good. Actually, nonetheless, there's a sensibility that you've brought to those old stories that does crack them open again, that gives them a kind of fresh life in a way.
I don't think you need to scream and scold readers by saying Hitler bad. Like we
got that.
You describe and you illuminate. But when you look at these stories and you see the systems they were part of, or the patterns they were a part of, where once, observer just wouldn't have paid any attention to that. They would have neglected the free black seaman on the wager. I
love that story, and I thought you dealt with that. This is the one person of colour in the story.
Yeah.
And of course, he sort of vanishes.
He vanishes.
And the gentle way that you did that I thought that was so true to the material.
Yeah, and that's a gap, right? We talked about the gap. You can't tell his story because...
But that's so moving. That makes it so... I found that really touching, that moment.
And I think that's where, as you were saying, the modern perspective, because we're all telling history from a present vantage point.
Yeah.
And it's why there is no definitive history. And it's why there's revisionists and history changes. And I always believe history is this kind of, I look at it much more as this organism that with more perspective changes and grows and new, like we talked about Philby, you said, oh, I didn't know about this perspective. And so your lens shifts and you're adding to the body.
Absolutely. I mean, and in previous histories of the wager, that character
he's not yet.
Would have been ignored.
I don't even think he's, he
would have just disappeared.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience with the Colditz story, which, as I say, was sort of presented as a story of brave British chaps doing the right thing. There was one person of colour in there, an Indian doctor, whose story was in some ways even more remarkable than anybody else's, but had been excluded. I don't think deliberately or for overtly racist reasons, but his story didn't really fit with the accepted template of the narrative. And so there is an opportunity to take stories we think we know and find new angles and avenues on them, always. And I'm always amazed by how much material there is if you look hard enough. Well, we could go on for another 3 hours, but David, thank you so much, and may you find many, many more trunks filled with new material.
Oh, thank you, and may you find many declassified and unclassified documents listing in the archive with pearls and secrets. But it was such a pleasure to talk to you. We could go on and on. Let's move it over to the pub now.
Exactly. Fantastic.